On No Good Deed, Cynthia was singing as she was flying around, just like Defying Gravity, but this time she's flying next to flame. She's got big wind machines on her. It was far more of a challenge. I'm Simon Hayes. I'm the production sound mixer on Wicked for Good.
Hi, I'm Myron Kerstein, and I'm the picture editor for Wicked for Good, and we are going behind the scenes with Collider. They all evolve over the course of editing both these movies over the past 3 years. I had the privilege to edit 250 hours of footage and narrow it down to 5 hours of 2 movies. And of course, there's magic in those dailies that Simon is capturing on the set, but it's a process that all the scenes sort of develop over the time. But I would say with, at least for Wicked for Good, the whole tone of the entire film really had to be found through the whole process of the edit. A lot of films live and die from beginnings and endings. And so we spent a lot of time defining what the tone was in the first act, as well as delivering the emotion of the ending and making it feel like the ending of a saga. John M. Chu asked us to dream big, and he said to me, we're making the greatest love story that was ever told meets Lord of the Rings. We all had to meet that bar and deliver the intimacy and the wonder of Oz. I was so lucky to have Simon to sort of work as a collaborator.
You know, one of the really exciting things for me was having Myron, the picture editor, on the set with us. He was popping down on a daily basis. We were able to talk about where we were going sonically. We were able to collaborate so that I knew exactly what he needed for Avid, and I could fine-tune that depending on what the song was and where we were going with it. Now, what was interesting about what Myron and I were doing on Wicked for Good was we were leaning a lot more heavily on the live keyboard. And what that did was it gave Cynthia and Ari complete and utter freedom. But what it did for Myron and I was it gave Myron a wealth of emotion, but also we had to be very careful about tempo. Because of course, when you give complete freedom to a keyboard, it doesn't always mean that every take is going to cut with each other. So what I had to try and do was to make sure that John Chu, Cynthia and Ari were given this freedom, but that I didn't give Myron a complete nightmare trying to cut different takes together with different tempos. So trying to keep within a tempo map secretly to be able to give Myron the ability to cut from take to take really was the secret sauce on Wicked for Good.
An example was the actual song For Good. There was a pre-record track of that song, and initially John and Alice were shooting these big crane shots, and so it was very sweeping. And so, you know, of course, you want to, one of the last songs of the film, you want it to be sweeping and big, and you want to go, buzz around Kiamako Castle, and it's going to be epic, right? And then what we found is the more intimate coverage with the close-ups, which also happened to be off-tempo, and the piano was not leading Ari and Cynthia. Cynthia and Ari were leading the piano, and it is like jazz. It is sort of like you're cutting for emotion. And I think that's an example when you're reading the script, you're seeing something that's on the page is going to be epic and dazzling. But when you're actually cutting it and seeing this incredible performance and see what Simon captured, you know, you end up cutting more for the intimacy and start to lean into these two characters saying goodbye. And so that's just an example of how on the page it could be really big and grand. And when you see in the dailies for the first time, you're like, okay, well, you know, let's make it epic. But as the process continues, you want to make it more emotional.
We devised this methodology on the set, especially for Wicked for Good. There's a great example that Myron gives because we're weaving in and out of dialogue and song, particularly at the beginning of the song, where one line can be sung on one take and it can be spoken on the next take. And Ari and Cynthia were really playing with it and letting their emotions drive where their characters were going with that song. So what we did to make sure that Myron had some kind of tempo, we devised a system where Ben Holder, our keyboard player, was given a click track in his IEM, but we weren't playing that click track to Cynthia and Ari because I really didn't want them to feel hemmed in. But what it did mean was, although Ben was never driving, he was never leading the performance, he had a reference, a time frame in his ear that would give him some kind of reference for tempo to keep Myron stuck in that tempo lock. And what we did was we had a track on my production sound dailies, which was kind of a secret track, which was that same click track, which Ari and Cynthia never heard, but Ben had and Myron had. So even when we strayed from that, because Cynthia or Ari would take a moment, take a breath, reflect emotionally, then we could come right back in and hopefully start to get back into that tempo. And that click track was kind kind of like our reveal in the dailies, where Myron could go, okay, well, let me just see where we are here. Listen to the keyboard, listen to the vocal, and then reference it with this secret ISO track of the click and make sure that we were still on the time zone.
Yeah, sometimes when they take a breath or they'll say dialogue, I'm still trying to understand the sort of rhythm of the entire song. That way, when I find my way, it doesn't seem like we're outside the musical. And what I learned from working with John M2, from working on And the Heights, and then on Tick, Tick, Boom with Lynn, is the ability to stretch and break the song, but still make it feel organic enough that you don't get lost in it. And so when you have a scene like in Defying Gravity, where you're stopping, starting the song like a number of times, and we're doing that in Dancing Through Life, through the Oz's Ballroom, as well as in musical numbers like No Place Like Home, or Long As You're Mine, or even in For Good, you're always trying to keep the idea of still being grounded in the musical in some way.
I think that's one of the main differences between Wicked and Wicked for Good. On Wicked, although we used the keyboard, we used it sparingly. By the time we got to For Good, we were really leaning into that emotional aspect and really giving so much freedom to the cast. And that is not an easy thing to present to Myron. It dictates sometimes what takes can be used and what takes can't. But hopefully what we did was, by giving that tempo map, we gave Myron the ability to use all of the emotional pieces without ever feeling restricted in any way, despite the fact that a lot of the time we were just kind of, like Byron says, it was jazz. You know, we were feeling it as we went along. The recording of For Good was incredibly challenging, because one of the things that we all decided that we needed to support John M. Chu on was the fact that we needed as much reality on screen as possible. We didn't want this to be a blue screen movie. Of course, we're using VFX, but whatever we could make real, we wanted it to be real. Now on For Good, it's autumn, and the leaves are basically underfoot and they're blowing around, because remember, that performance takes place outside. It's an exterior performance on a balcony. And if you look at the wide shots, there's leaves, and those aren't VFX leaves, those are real leaves, because John Chu and Myron and Alice all truly believe, and I support them in this, that the more reality we can have on the screen, the better it is. Just like having live performances vocally, if we can have real sets and real leaves and real wind, that is going to make the audience feel more immersed in the visuals and the whole story. So what we had when we're recording For Good with those live vocals is we had silent wind machines blowing those leaves around. We had puddles, and what we were doing was literally, we were kind of mapping out from a take-to-take basis where we could see leaves, reducing the wind machines. We'd already devised a system for having the wind machines outside the movie set, completely outside the stage, and piping in the wind so we couldn't hear any of the mechanical aspects. But then what we were doing was making sure that we were only putting leaves and blowing them in the parts of the set that we could see visually. Whenever one of the puddles was suddenly became out of frame because we moved up a lens size, we'd be mopping up puddles to reduce the footfall through the water. And so it really was a kind of collaboration between everyone on the set, the props department, the art department, everyone, to just try and support these live vocals and the emotions so that what we presented to Myron was completely usable.
It was incredible to get dailies for, let's say, like Thank Goodness, where they're shooting outside of Munchkin Land and it's raining half the time and it's wind and there's drones trying to, capture paparazzi footage buzzing around. And somehow Simon is capturing the most incredible vocals from Ariana Grande that I've ever heard day in, day out. I would say another moment in No Good Deed where the wind that's blowing on Cynthia on this close-up. And at first, John and I, we started leaning into the more sort of crane shots and more epic nature of that number. But when we saw this close-up and the recordings of Cynthia, and she's just feeling this pain and everything that just happened to her with Fierro, and just her feeling lost and trying to, and her anger, staying into this messy sort of take. I could never do that if it wasn't for Simon being able to achieve what he did technically. So that's an example where sometimes the messiness of the camera or whatever the actor is doing, as long as you have the recording and you can lean into what we're feeling and don't worry about the rest, and then hopefully the audience will connect to it.
On No Good Deed, it's really interesting because Cynthia was singing as she was flying around, just like Defying Gravity, but this time she's flying next to flame. She's got big wind machines on her. It was far more of a challenge. And And the fact is that we did a couple of takes to the pre-record, but John Chu decided there was something within the live performance that didn't exist within the pre-record. And so what I really knew that I needed to do for Myron was, although the vocal recording that I was going to get on the set would have some wind noise on it, and it would have a bit of special effects noise as they're flying her around, there was also some kind of truth, some kind of fragility that you don't find in the pre-record when someone's comfortable singing in a music recording studio. When you actually hoist them up and they're flying through the air and they're flying right next to flames and there's a wind machine on them, there's some kind of emotional life that exists within that vocal that, as Myron says, despite the fact that it's slightly messier technically, there is a beauty in it which doesn't exist in the pre-record. So for me, trying to make sure that I could always deliver those vocals that were good enough to use, that was key. And the fact that Myron now says that he was able to use it makes me very, very proud.
For me, was the first moment that I ended up looking at the dailies of the Ozda's Ballroom and realizing, and then editing, and then putting together, and then that's this sort of philosophy and attitude started spreading through the entire movie, is that it's about the intimacy of these two characters. And if I can get that right, and if the audience can connect to that, and then we have two movies that's going to work. And so I was really proud about when I started seeing those dailies, and I was crying every day and watching them. But it's specifically, I remember watching those dailies, in Bournemouth at Sky Studios, and just being really connected emotionally to it. And then I was like, this is the key. This scene is the key to the two movies. And that it's about this relationship. And if I can make that work the way I'm responding to the dailies, and I can then translate that through the two movies, and then they're going to work.
For me, it's the duet at the end of For Good. And it's simply because I felt like every single day that I've ever spent on a movie set mixing sound was preparing me to be able to mix those two vocalists. And when those two start singing together, something special happens. And at that moment, when they're stood facing each other, nose to nose, and we're in a close-up, and they are basically playing with each other's voices. What would happen was we would do a take, and Cynthia would just let Ari just sit on top of her vocal and pull her vocal back a little bit. And then Ari would pull hers back and let Cynthia go a little bit loud. And it was just like hearing these two world-class vocalists just giving something very, very special, very emotional. I had tears running down my cheeks, but I also knew that every single moment of my career had been preparing me for being able to deliver that vocal true to Myron, and for it to be good enough for me to be able to say, yes, that can go in the movie.
I hope that viewers sort of just take in not only the technical achievement of these two movies, because it's really hard to pull off one movie in 3 years of this scale, but to do two of those movies. But not only that, but that you could feel the love and care from this family that came together to make these two movies, and how that translated into the love and care of these two characters and of the story that we're telling. I think that there's thousands of beating hearts and artisans that worked on these two movies, and it was unlike anything I think I'll ever experience in my career again. And I think that there's something special that is almost magical or spiritual about these two movies. I think that the audience feels something. It's not just what the actors brought, or John or Alice or Simon or myself. It's this collective of humanity. I think that there's something about these two movies that we pulled it off to make that is incredibly special, that is human and is full of love.
John Chu and Mark Platt put together an extraordinary team. They created a feeling of familiarity on the set, a feeling of family, and it didn't feel like we were on a huge studio picture. It actually felt like we were on a small independent, because we were also supported and also looked after. And sometimes I'd kind of blink and look and see these huge sets, the biggest sets that I've ever worked on, and 300 crew members, and think, but this feels like a small movie. And that was because of the mood that was on the set, and that really starts with John and Mark. I got invited into this family. Myron and Alice were already part of the family, and I just immediately felt at home, and I immediately felt incredibly valued and supported. And that is the feeling that John Chu creates on a film set.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I'm really excited for people to actually see everything that goes on behind the scenes and how these two films were created. So thank you so much for your time, and it was such a pleasure meeting both of you.